Tell me about the baffling rise of the smug centrist podcasts.
Well, you got to tell me because I can't really get to the bottom of it particularly. But we were talking about this on the Spike podcast the other week, and we've all noticed them, haven't we? The sort of rest is politics, the news agents, this kind of explosion. Because for a while, I think a lot of us who were engaged in certainly political commentary thought that the sort of establishment centrist line was reassuringly absent from the alternative podcast kind of media space. And yet they've piled in a big way, and in many respects are doing quite well out of it. I mean, the rest is politics, the Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart circle jerk that you can listen to several times a week. They sold out the O2 not too long ago. So there's clearly an audience for this kind of thing. But it's been kind of, I find it an interesting, quite amusing phenomenon, just because they seem to me to be people who have no idea that their day is kind of over. Like the kind of worldview that they attach themselves to, that essentially Blairism forever would be a kind of utopia, that everything was always going to head in the right direction. And also the sense that they kind of haven't caught up with how the world has moved on, that we live in a very different time now, is a kind of non-stop source of amusement as much as anything else. So it's curious that they've kind of risen to such prominence, but I guess there was always going to be an audience to that to a certain extent. And I suppose it's also a reminder that we do live in this sort of populist era where you have a kind of silent majority or a forgotten mass of people out there who are putting their issues back on the table, who are voting for parties that they're told not to vote for, who are really kind of revolting against the establishment. But, in an era of quote unquote polarized politics, there is going to be another pole. So I think they represent that section of kind of, if not elite opinion, an elite leaning opinion that just desperately wants to hit the reset button and go back to 1997. And I think that's one of the things that makes them so ill-equipped to make sense of the time that we find ourselves in.
Who are the people listening to those podcasts?
I mean, I suppose the sort of people who still think Tony Blair is the best thing that's sliced bread. They must exist. Every nation has their nutters. But one thing that I find quite interesting about them is just how sort of low effort a lot of it is. Like we were talking about this on the show. Like the news agents, Lewis Goodall, Emily Maitlis, and John Sopel, all of them ex-BBC, who make a great break out of their ironclad duty to be impartial, to tell us all what they really think.
Yeah.
And it turns out they think exactly what you thought all along. Lewis Goodall, I mean, he's at least gives the impression that he reads the news and that he cares about policy. Got in trouble for some comments about inheritance tax the other day. But like Sopel and Matlis, I think are just winging it most of the time. I mean, it's slightly alarming as to maybe how low effort it was for them to carry on in their respective perches at the BBC, just regurgitating like third-hand Radio 4 talking points and passing that off as commentary. So I suppose there's an audience for that. But I just, whenever I see those clips, whenever I occasionally kind of have a bit of a hate listen, you just think that they're kind of in a bit of a parallel universe, and I haven't really clocked just how much public debate and the world has moved on. And incidentally, also, a lot of these people I see as they're kind of in the mold of Blair, people who would kind of see themselves as his children or his acolytes or whatever. Whether they would admit that or not, I think that's broadly speaking what their politics are. What I find interesting about them and a lot of liberal left commentary is that they haven't even noticed that people like Blair have kind of clocked that things have moved on. I mean, in recent years, Tony Blair, as much as I loathe the man for all the reasons that I think people can guess, he's made some pretty pointed interventions on the trans issue. I mean, he was the one who forced Keir Starmer to admit that women can't have a penis, if you remember that, during the election campaign. He wrote this piece with a very odd formulation, which was something along the lines of a man is with a penis and a woman is with a vagina, as if they were standing next to each other or something. Didn't really make a lot of sense.
Sounds like the start of a joke.
Yeah, no, exactly. And then an Englishman and an Irishman walking or whatever. That was the thing that gave Keir Starmer an excuse to say, not that a woman can't have a penis, but he just said, I agree with Tony Blair. So that kind of gave him a get-out clause.
God,
more recently,
it's pathetic. Like he's walking around with a little T-shirt. I agree with Tony Blair.
Which you needn't say really. That kind of makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And also pathetic because you've got Rosie Duffield in your own party trying to get you to take this issue seriously for so long, being bombarded with the most horrific abuse and threats for sticking up for women's rights, and the only person you'll listen to is Tony Blair. I mean, it just absolutely stinks. So I have more recently, you've had Tony Blair come out and make statements about how maybe this net zero thing isn't a great idea. Maybe, or at least the way it's being done is something that isn't going to attract much public support, and getting a lot of flack from the Labour Party, from the kind of current Labour Party for doing so. And also more recently, in response to Reform's announcement on asylum and migration and whatnot, you've had a series of former New Labour cabinet ministers making interventions saying, yes, we need to get a grip on this. Maybe we should suspend our membership of the ECHR. Maybe we should do this or do that. People like David Blunkett, people like Jack Straw, who, supposedly were members of a government which was the greatest thing since sliced bread, if you take these podcasts at face value. Even they've noticed what way the wind is blowing. And yet I think because a lot of it is so low effort and vibes based, these podcasts, that is, they just haven't even noticed that, it seems like.
It's interesting. I mean, really smart, well-meaning people make huge mistakes that ruin countries. That just happens. I think of the China one-child policy, for example, and now they're struggling with population decline, and just nobody, even the cleverest people in China, nobody saw that coming. Like that boggles the mind to me that there was no one high up in the sort of Chinese Communist Party or whatever who said, you know what, though, we might actually in 20 years. No one ran that simulation forward 20 years and went, oh shit. And I think it's similar with our immigration situation. And it's not just Labour Party. I've seen, Daniel Finkelstein, he was in with the Conservatives, wasn't he? And I've seen him write about this was a huge, huge mistake that we made by letting in so many people. I think a lot of people maybe were well-meaning and they look back now and go, what did we do? How did we not see this coming? It seemed so obvious that this would happen, and it's happened anyway. I wonder with Emily Maitlis and Rory Stewart and these kinds of people, we have this basic issue. It's one I ran into with Ian Dale recently when he said he lived in Tunbridge Wells, and if he sees a foreign person, he's very curious about who they are, what and all those things. And I said, well, where I live, if you see a white person, you're very curious because there's just none. Not that everyone has to be white, but that's the area I live in compared to the area he lives in, and it might be that anywhere versus somewhere principle. Do you know of that one?
Yeah, David Goodhart's.
Is that who it was? Yeah. Do you want to take that? Do you know what I mean? Emily Maitlis would be one of there'd be a anywhere person.
Yes, exactly. And this was, I think, The Road to Somewhere was the name of the book. Came out around the time of Brexit and was a very useful frame for talking about the kind of gap between most of the country and the people who govern us, who set the media agenda. So, and these two broad camps that you've got the anywheres, who are people who have gone to pretty nice university, who aren't necessarily as attached to the idea of like national identity, their local area. They could basically feel at home in London or San Francisco or Paris or what have you. Are kind of both economically, socially, and literally more mobile, if you see what I mean. And the somewheres, people who, partly by dint of their class background, are much more wedded and anchored down in the community in which they were brought up, don't tend to move around as much, maybe didn't go to university, more attached to the idea of national identity, and that being the kind of great cultural chasm. I forget the exact number that he puts on it, but it's something like the kind of anywheres of like maybe 25% of the population, and the somewheres of more like the pretty larger majority. I might have that slightly wrong. But that, I think, gets you a long way to understanding that chasm between those who govern us and the people who are governed, the complete difference in priorities, the difference in cultural outlook. If you're of a more sort of cosmopolitan outlook, you're going to be slightly more bemused, at least, by people who see national identity or pride in history or what have you as more important. And I think so many of our battles in recent years in politics are quite neatly explained when you recognise that there are, broadly speaking, those two camps. There's all kinds of different, there's all kinds of gradients in between. Of course, not everyone perfectly fits into one of those categories. But I think that gets you a long way to explaining things, and also gets you a long way to explaining how blind a certain set are. And I'm not necessarily naming any names here, apart from maybe Emily Maitlis and newsagents, but because they all tend to like live an existence which is shared by their coterie, but not by the vast majority of people in the country. So it's one of those things where that dividing line has become more and more stark, and it basically cuts across every one of the big issues that we talk about. That the anywheres are on this side of the argument and somewheres are on this one. So it's still, I think, all these years later, a pretty useful way of thinking about some of these things. It's
really interesting that and the older I've gotten, the more it's made sense to me. And I'm probably very much an anywhere person because I had a nice, whatever, and like we were often abroad, or I lived abroad for many, like 12, 13 years, and sort of got involved in different cultures and things like that, and then just sort of, I'll pop back. And it's been part of a political journey for me that's taken quite some years, part of growing up, I suppose. And I'd like to think part of empathy that everybody who is an anywhere person should have. just to be able to understand, hey, for some people, it's not just an option to F off and leave. I've talked about it before, like, I would probably go off to Argentina if it got too hot here, as in spicy, as in that's not an option for everybody. Not just financially, but just culturally. It's just not even. And the street they live in is everything, and it's being taken away from them. Very much the same way that we've seen in movies. If it happens to the indigenous Americans, or if it happens to the Japanese, or whoever it is, we'd be expected to feel empathy for those people and say, "Gosh, that's their culture, their street, their local places, their families," and it's changed before their eyes in a matter of years.
Yeah, and it being a change that it didn't ask for.
Yeah,
and if anything, at every single opportunity, have voted against. I can't remember the exact numbers, but one of the communications firms crunched the numbers on basically public support for various different levels of migration. And it's something like it's like roughly about, say, 10% of the population actually supported being north of 100,000 net migration a year. It hasn't been that low since the 1990s. So it's the sort of thing where you just quite clearly see that the yawning kind of democratic deficit, if you want to use the slightly tired terms, on that issue in particular is so stark. And I think that's another thing about this kind of anywhere, somewhere divide. It is a class divide in many respects. Brexit happens and you've got various lovies saying, well, I guess I would just flee the country. That's a luxury that most people don't have. A few votes don't go their way, or a few governments betray them. They can't up sticks and move. I also think it's a big part of the reason why people in the more elite establishment sections of society are so much more blasé, not just about nationhood and sovereignty and whatever, but about kind of democracy itself, why they're so much more relaxed about globalist institutions like the European Union or what have you, being able to set policy and really shape politics. A, because they assume that the people making those decisions are quite like them and they're more or less on board with that, so that's good. But B, because of the fact that if you've got a bit of money, if you've got a fair amount of influence, if you're a bit more mobile, if you can move around the world, if you happen not to like the drift of the particular country that you're living in, the vote is less important to you. And I think that's a point that Tony Benn of the old Labour left used to say, that the vote means more to someone who has less in life. So I think it explains so much that key divide and their willingness to not only side with the European Union, but also try to thwart Brexit, I think was a good example of that.